I saw the degradation in the emotional regulation, in the advocate's ability to work with people who were bringing severe trauma to the table. And that was the catalyst for me, at least within my own agency, to talk about, if we don't support our advocates, they are never going to be able to support the survivors.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Or if this is your first time joining in, thank you for being with us. This podcast is a safe space for victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault to share their stories and connect with others who've been through similar experiences. I believe that sharing our stories is the first step to healing, and my hope is that the SAS podcast will help victims and survivors feel less alone and more empowered. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and I'm here each week to provide a platform for victims and survivors to tell their story and for experts and professionals to offer insights and information to help us all on our healing path and to provide an education on being trauma-informed in order to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape or sexual assault. If you are a victim, survivor, or know someone who is, or if you investigate or prosecute rape or sexual assault cases, or if you provide treatment, counseling, or interact with victims or survivors of rape or sexual assault in any capacity, I urge you to listen to this podcast. Remember, you are not alone, and we are all here to support you. Hi, everyone. I'm glad you're here. Thank you for being a part of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Before we get to this week's guest, I just want to share some of my thoughts and observations with you about what's happening behind the scenes here at Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. This show is growing, and it's because of the amazing guests that are strong and brave enough to share their rape or sexual assault stories so that others can benefit from knowing that they are not alone in their experience and that there is a commonality in the healing process. But it's also because of some of the amazing experts and special guests that have been on the show to share their expertise in areas like being trauma-informed and the intricacies of investigating and prosecuting rape and sexual assault cases, or even an expert on how to defend yourself against personal violence. I'm hearing from guests and listeners alike how this show has impacted their lives in cathartic and liberating ways. I mention all of this just to put an emphasis on how important this podcast is and how you can help it keep growing and impacting victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault in healing ways. I am thrilled that you are part of this show and that you're benefiting from what I'm offering. And I'd just like to ask all of you to share the podcast with others by copying the link to the show or to the individual episodes, and sending those links to your family, friends, coworkers, or even an acquaintance. This podcast is for everyone. I can't emphasize that enough. Yes, victims and survivors are benefiting from this show, but so are police officers, detectives, prosecutors, clergy members, medical personnel, mental health providers, social services caseworkers, human resources administrators, educational leaders and instructors. Anyone you can think of can benefit from this show because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. So please help keep the growth going. Share the podcast and episode links and tell everyone you know about the show. And please subscribe, rate, and comment on the show on any of the platforms where you get your podcasts. You have my sincere and heartfelt appreciation for doing this. Now, on to this week's show. This is episode 41, and I had the privilege of having Nicole Florisi as my guest this week. Nicole graciously returned to the show to discuss a pressing concern she has in her role as a therapist, instructor, and former law enforcement officer. Specifically, she focused on the lack of concern, undervaluation, and neglect experienced by victim advocates when it comes to the impact of vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma affects individuals who empathize and engage with victims and survivors of direct trauma. Unfortunately, it often goes unrecognized and unprocessed as caregivers prioritize and tend to the immediate needs of trauma victims. The consequences to this neglect can be devastating. While editing this episode and re-listening to the interview with Nicole, I realized that many people will relate to and be affected by the insights and information she shares. In addition to discussing the impact of vicarious trauma, Nicole reveals methods and practices that can alleviate its symptoms and causes. She also highlights the steps that can be taken to change the workplace culture for victim advocates, first responders, and others whose jobs may expose them to vicarious trauma. This information will also be impactful for victims and survivors themselves. Simply put, this episode is, again, for everyone. As Nicole delves into the topic of vicarious trauma, its effects, and the solutions to help alleviate or even prevent PTSD, you will hear and often feel her deep compassion and empathy for those suffering from this devastating condition. She advocates for necessary changes in the environments that require vulnerability to vicarious trauma to better support and attend to these individuals. Give this episode a listen, and I'm sure you'll hear exactly what I'm talking about. Here's Nicole. Hey, everybody. It's amazing for me to have Nicole Florisi back with us. She popped into the studio via Zoom, and I'm really thankful that she's here.
Hey, Dave, as always, thank you for the invite. It's much appreciated.
You're more than welcome, and I really appreciate your presence because it's always great for my audience to hear from you. Maybe a place to go would be to talk about the victim advocacy field and how much vicarious trauma victim advocates take on. And I know that's true because I've acted in the role of victim advocate myself. Also, I've seen it with some of the victim advocates I've worked with when I was in law enforcement. Talk to us a little bit about what your thoughts are on this.
Well, it wasn't something, when I first started working in law enforcement, I'd been in law enforcement as a police officer for, I think we're coming up on about 23 years now. Victim advocates were not always present. That basically became an evolution throughout my career. And then there was a split among advocates to a degree. You had advocates that would work directly for a law enforcement agency or potentially the county attorney's office. Or the opposite end would be like a domestic violence shelter, a sanctuary, sexual assault services. I think it was a population that we didn't really start talking about for quite some time because we didn't realize that they fell into that vicarious trauma umbrella. And until I saw it firsthand, where it was kind of smack in the face, is really what opened my eyes. I've worked in law enforcement. We agree there's vicarious trauma there. I've worked as a therapist. We have the conversations about vicarious and secondary trauma there. I think advocates do not get wrapped up into that conversation nearly enough. And so when I was running a domestic violence, sexual assault, and sex trafficking center here in Arizona for a couple of years, I saw the degradation in the emotional regulation, in the advocate's ability to work with people who were bringing severe trauma to the table. And that was the catalyst for me, at least within my own agency, to talk about if we don't support our advocates, they are never going to be able to support the survivors. I saw things initially when I started there that were very concerning. If advocates cannot emotionally regulate, if they are not able to be responsive versus reactive, that is going to absolutely inadvertently, though, but it is going to happen. It's going to inadvertently get taken out on the people that we're supposed to be serving. I think we have an obligation, if not ultimate responsibility, to make sure that advocates have support as well. And I just think they are not nearly enough part of the conversation, so they get the support they need to continue to support survivors.
I don't think there's a statement you've just made that I don't agree with. In fact, I'm constantly amazed at the lack of support that victim advocates get when I do trainings and they're part of my multidisciplinary audience. They start hearing some of the things that I have to say about what victims are going through and how important it is to be trauma informed. And on breaks or afterwards, they come up to me and say, hey, wait, what about us? We're not getting that trauma-informed training like we should. And that's, I think, an interesting aspect to what I do in that surprised me. I would have thought that being trauma-informed would be almost like a prerequisite, but I'm realizing more and more, especially through this podcast, how few and far between those people are that are trauma-informed. And I'm wondering what your take is on that.
Well, I will say that I was very lucky to a degree that the program I ran, having some both federal and state funding, there are certain state requirements that do provide education and information on trauma-informed services. But I think what's missing is the part you're talking about. We can provide information on trauma-informed services. How should we interact with survivors and victims? How should we best talk to them? What is the best way to support them? But what's missing to me in the majority of all trauma-informed conversations is where is the component of self-regulation? Where's the component for the person in the support role? There is not enough conversation about that. In fact, even working previously as a therapist, I don't think there's enough conversation there that talks about whether it's therapists or even master's levels clinicians in school, psychologists, school students who are doing their internship. They're going to work with all sorts of populations. And the education component, it's very brief, if at all. So I will say in my case, I was at least lucky where advocates were mandated X amount of hours if they were going to be working with both domestic violence or sexual assault survivors. So they had exposure on what should be best, what is the best way, most appropriate way to interact with trauma survivors, whatever journey that person's on. I saw firsthand, and I think there's many people out there who have worked similar roles who probably see the same things just as you did, the self-regulation, the emotional intelligence component, the discussion about vicarious trauma is not deep enough. And second to that, we could talk about it all day long, but if we are not providing advocates the skill sets to manage their vicarious trauma, resiliency skills, just as we would first responders, just as people who provide therapy, and skills to any type of trauma survivor, you are walking away. The goal is to walk away with a skill set to be able to mitigate, if not prevent, right? We're usually in mitigation phase with survivors, but mitigate trauma, give them skill sets that are tangible, something they can use when they walk away, but we're not getting that to the advocate level. We're talking about it if we're lucky, but talking isn't good enough. If talking were good enough, suicide rates would be zero across the board in every population. If talking about resiliency and talking about grit and talking about how we support ourselves was good enough, we would be doing much better. And the truth is, we still have a lot of room to grow.
It was almost universal that every training I ever did on being trauma informed, on how to interview, on perpetrator mentality, I always ended it with at least an hour, preferably more, on vicarious trauma and how first responders and caregivers and victim advocates should be taking care of themselves. I think you're right. I don't think we see enough of that. I also don't think we see it internally. Maybe they get that when they go to a class, some vicarious trauma awareness and training, and how are you taking care of yourself kind of questions. What are you doing to self-heal, to self-regulate? Because there's not enough self-regulation going on, and that's bleeding over into the client population. It was amazing. That was almost always the most talked about aspect of the trainings was, hey, I got a whole lot out of that vicarious trauma information and how better to take care of myself. Tell us some of the things that you most recommend for victim advocates and other first responders in taking care of themselves.
Well, there's a fantastic book by Dr. Robbie Adler-Tapia. This one I'm talking about is specific to first responders, but it's called One Badge, One Brain, One Life. And she has some very specific resiliency skills that first responders will tend to engage in because that's really the goal, right? We have to get buy-in from the population that's going to be doing the skill sets. Because again, we can talk about them all day long until we're blue in the face. But if people walk away from a training with an unwillingness to implement the resiliency skills, we failed. So I tend to gravitate toward her stuff quite a bit, regardless of who I'm talking to. I think we have to have a discussion, one, that breathing is the answer to a lot of problems. And we have to have a discussion on what that looks like for advocates. I mean, and I want you to think about this just one step further. Many advocates are trained in some type of, whether it's like a box breathing or relaxation breathing, some type of skill to help survivors calm. but they tend, even if they know that and will engage with it with another participant, they don't tend to walk into another room and do it when they're feeling dysregulated. I think the biggest thing is, one, we need to talk about the skills, which I will, but two, and equally important, it has to be part of the culture in that agency, whatever that agency is, law enforcement, nonprofit, a private sector. Resiliency has to be part of the culture. All talk, and no walk benefits no one. I'm happy to kind of morph into what some of those resiliency skills look like, but I just think we need to put that on the table, because wellness needs to be more than a program. That's not good enough. That's check the box. If you see how well it's worked for first responders, you know what I'm talking about. Program isn't good enough. Culture is where it needs to be. We need to be comfortable talking about emotions, emotional expression, all the things that are going to surface from some type of acute trauma response in the body, what a person is going to feel like, what's going to happen when they can't sleep, lack of sleep hygiene, how that's going to impact not just the survivor, but the advocates when they go home and they've heard these horrible things and they can't get pictures out of their head. It has to be part of the culture. If programs worked, again, there are individual programs that are great, but if programs as a whole worked overall, we'd be doing a lot better as a population in general, because we have a lot of talk about this kind of stuff. One of the best things you can do is some type of, whether it's box breathing, relaxation breathing, and whatnot. And what I'm happy to do, I think we talked about this last time, I will provide you the information. Anybody that's listening to your podcast will have explicit directions on how to do this, so they have takeaway. Something with a bilateral component. I think not enough is talked about the benefits of bilateral stimulation and bilateral movement of some sort. Take this for what it's worth. Most people have a little familiarity, especially when they're listening to your podcast, about EMDR type therapy. But when you think about bilateral movement, something so simple as a slinky. I had one in my office as a therapist. Kids aren't the ones that use the slinkies. I mean, think about when we sit and we ruminate, we hyper focus on all of these things going inside our brain, just kind of entrenching that trauma and toxicity. Something so simple as putting a slinky in your hand and starting to get some bilateral movement with it. People tend to start talking. It's not a full-blown type of EMDR by any means, but that is a beginning step to bilateral movement. Even doing the same thing, think about, instead of sitting in the chair and ruminating and hyper-focusing, doing nothing more than one step and getting up and pacing. Just walking is a bilateral movement. Moving your arms, the difference just in that. Adding bilateral components to box breathing. Inhaling for 4, holding for 4, blowing out for 4, but then adding bilateral movement components to the breathing. And then there's some great research that has just come out, and I'll provide that to you as well, on something called the cyclic sigh. And that has been shown to really drive down physiology from an acute stress response. Actually better than box breathing and tactical breathing. So that is really great. The part I add about the bilateral movement that I learned from Dr. Robbie into box breathing is a trauma mitigation component. Now, the cyclic sigh in and of itself, matched up with box breathing, the cyclic sigh is much more beneficial in driving down that physiological response. I'll be happy to provide that so your listeners can understand what that looks like and implement that. But I think we have an obligation and responsibility to actually sit down with people and have them do the skills with us. Like, I would never have anybody in my office as a therapist and say, here's how you do it, and then have a nice day. We do it together. And I know it can be off-putting sometimes if you're in a room full of people. Humor and lighten the mood. Have everybody do it together. And, there'll be some laughing and joking. That's fine. But as long as you normalize that and make it part of the culture, grounding techniques, mindfulness. Grounding techniques are critical in managing emotions, just being able to be present. The one I tend to teach law enforcement, because it's quick, something simple, 30 to 60 seconds of your life. I do one with a hot drink. So I tell first responders, hey, go into a room, it's quiet, like no phone, no pets, no family members, you are alone. This is a safe spot. This isn't something we're doing in our police cars. But you take a cup of hot liquid, and I'm just going to use coffee because I love the smell of coffee. So you're going to have your hot cup of coffee, something that you love the aroma of, whether it's hot cocoa, peppermint tea, something like that. And you sit with it, you put your hands on that cup, and you just sit and feel the heat of that cup. And you inhale, you're taking these great deep breaths, and you're inhaling that delicious scent, whatever it is that you have. And then when you go to drink that coffee, you take a sip, and you just feel the heat of that coffee in your mouth. And when you swallow, and how it feels as it's going down. Something like that is so simple and takes literally 30 to 60 seconds if you really decide to engage with it. Something as simple as that helps dampen a heightened amygdala. It really, really does. And, heightened amygdala is one of the core features of a lot of hypervigilance. A heightened amygdala does tend to create some emotional dysregulation. It interferes with sleep. It does create potential for hypervigilance, inability to focus, inability to concentrate, and importantly for survivors, inability to feel safe. But then think about when the people who are providing you support are still stuck in that same wheel, and then they're not feeling safe. So we have people who are feeling unsafe supporting people who are unsafe, that have experienced that same thing. It's stuff like that. Grounding skills are fantastic. We need to talk about the benefits of exercise. Exercise helps dump cortisol. Exercise creates a hormone in the brain, BDNF, which we make. It's brain-derived neurotropic factor. That helps dampen your amygdala. The older you get, unfortunately for us who are getting up there, the less you make, right? But, this is not about running the Ironman. It's about how are we getting some of this cortisol and how are we changing this acute stress response and getting rid of it. Now, ultimately, it does fall on the individual. Absolutely. You have to be able to walk away from the training or walk away from this podcast and agree to do it. But the culture of the agency, whomever we work for, is what's important to make that okay and normalize it and talk about these are the things you're going to feel and talk about the fact that there are ways to mitigate, if not prevent, and have those conversations that normalize it across the board for everyone. And we do it together and we support each other. And I think that's what makes the difference.
So I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but how do we change that culture? Talk to me about that.
This is Nicole's personal view on it. You can individually make changes at the bottom or no matter what your role is, right? I could have a conversation if I'm an advocate and I'm comfortable with this with another advocate. But it is a responsibility of the person who is heading that ship to make this part of the culture. It is their responsibility. People tend to walk away from that obligation. I really think so. And they don't understand the value it brings to the table. Healthy employees create healthy environments, which in turn, you have healthy advocates. They're going to do their best to support survivors in the manner that is necessary for them. But if you have an unhealthy culture and unhealthy advocates supporting people who are on their journey, wherever that may be, whether they're struggling, whether they are in their moments of severe trauma and whatever that looks like, it's really hard for somebody who is also unhealthy to support another person through health to resiliency. It really needs to be a conversation from the top. I really do think it's an obligation and responsibility.
That almost sounds counterintuitive to what most people would think, though. And that is the people at the top would be the most educated, would have the most knowledge, would be most involved in wanting their employees to be regulated and calm and well taken care of trauma-wise. And that's not happening.
No.
Where's the breakdown? People that go into leadership positions didn't start there. They started like me. I could have worked my way up past investigator, but chose not to. But I had lots of friends who did. They went to some of the same classes I did and know what it means to be trauma informed and know what it means to take care of yourself and help reduce your own vicarious trauma. Why isn't this happening?
Well, I don't have an absolute answer, but I can tell you, I think it's no different sometimes in law enforcement. The higher you get up the chain, the farther you get from remembering what it's like to work the street. I think it's just the distance and the disconnect and the fact that, like I said, it becomes a program and a check the box versus a culture, or at the very least, the continuing recognition of the importance of the health and well-being. I would like to think, this is anecdotal best, I would like to think somewhere we're making some headway and things are changing and we're growing overall. But the thing that slaps me in the face every day, and this is the human population in general, is substance use isn't going down. And substance use, we all can agree, tends to stem from trauma, and suicide rates are not going down in any population for the most part. So we can say we hope it's getting better, but the stats show it's really not. And the truth is, it's an individual choice. That person, that leader, has to choose to be part of the solution, because checking the box, you're still part of the problem.
I think I have a theory on that too. And that is, as you go up that ladder, like you said, the further you get from the street or the further you get from your roots of whatever they were in victim advocacy or social services work or the medical profession, even the further away you get from that initial indoctrination, the more vicarious trauma you absorb and the less you want to deal with it. I think there's a lot of people in the higher up echelon that just do not want to maybe even sometimes admit or acknowledge that they too have a lot of vicarious trauma that they never resolved. And rather than start dealing with their own vicarious trauma and their own issues, they just ignore it completely. And I think that trickles down.
Absolutely. And that's, that has its own name. That's trauma blindness at its best. But if that becomes the culture from the top, no one will have the support they need, not the advocates. Again, anybody working for that type of, nonprofit or private sector, the advocates, the therapists, case managers. I kind of look at advocacy as an extremely broad term, include case managers and therapists and psychologists and whatnot, both private sector and law enforcement. Law enforcement does, like we said, we've grown and we have victim advocates who are maybe assigned to the attorney's office or to sometimes a smaller police department will share a victim advocate. If trauma blindness, or honestly, in some cases, and this really pains me, people who just think we're all weak, right? That it's not that they're even blind to their own trauma. They don't want to actually admit that trauma exists, period. Now, I don't think that's the majority. I don't. Right. I don't have a stat to support it, I'll be honest, but I don't think that's the majority of people. However, it is pervasive in a couple types of organizations. You do see it sometimes in law enforcement, of course, first responder, like EMS, paramedic, people want to say, hey, you should be able to go home and come back to work every day and check your stuff at the door. Well, that's not how life works. So working in that field for quite a few years in the deviant sexual assault in the nonprofit sector, I saw the same thing. And there's just an expectation. You should be able to do this. You should be able to leave your stuff at home. If you're having personal problems, people additionally have personal traumas at home. It's not just about what they see at work. Kind of coming back to trauma blindness for a minute. I think sometimes if we do manage well, we still have a tendency to forget we could also be impacted. I mean, I can share that that's happened to me. I remember when I went from law enforcement to therapy, my clinical supervisor asked me, what are you going to do to not bring this home? And I got kind of a little cocky with her. I didn't mean to, but I said, I've been a cop for like 20 years. What makes you think I'm going to bring stuff home from the therapy side of things? Knowing better. Okay. Like, honestly, knowing better. Like that, want to talk about like something dumb that came out of my mouth? Absolutely. The same thing when I went in the DV world. I'm like, for all the things I've seen in law enforcement, is something really going to, and I say like top that or be more impactful? Yeah, there was. And I remember the day it smacked me in the face and I was like, I need a tune-up, man. Like I need a tune-up. So sometimes we just forget, even with the best intentions, and that's something too. I think we need to remind ourselves. I went to a first responder intensive. They kind of do post-critical incident stuff. It's like a 3-day intensive type seminar where they do EMDR and whatnot. And I went to vet the program. Like I went to say, would I send somebody to this program if they were involved in a critical incident? Well, I participated in the program. And it was a fantastic reminder that sometimes you got to check the oil and check the transmission fluid, make sure everything's working, because I realized that day I probably wasn't participating in my own care as well as I should. So that was a wake-up call. So there's that too. Sometimes we just get down the road and forget. We have an obligation also not to forget that too, so that was a good reminder for me. Like you can't expect that because you're doing well, you may not encounter a hurdle. So there's that as well. Or if you've done well for 30 years, sometimes something happens on 31 that opens the can of worms. Yeah. But we all have to have something. And, with law enforcement, I try and tell them, if you focus on your objective, like keep your eye on the prize, especially when we're talking about like child sex crimes and whatnot, justice for the victim, right? So I think about that mentality. And why is that important? Because we're human. And can we lose our tempers? Can we do something that impedes our own investigation? For sure. There's a great phrase that we have at Force Science that policing is a profession of emotions, yours included. To me, that's very, very huge. And so I think that also translates into all jobs. But if we can keep the focus, and this is no different for advocates, what is your ultimate goal or objective? If the goal is to support the survivor, however that is, whatever kind of support they need, because we meet people at their needs. What do they need from us that day? That fluctuates. What do they need from us to feel safe that day? What do they need that day to be successful on their journey? If both individuals are equally dysregulated, we're just not making the headway that we need. One of the two of them has the professional obligation to be dialed in. That's the difference. It doesn't mean there's no individual obligation on both sides. Everybody's on a journey. But advocates, the same as law enforcement, the same as therapists, the same as psychologists, the same as firefighters, have chosen a career that has a professional obligation of self-regulation. So it is a dual-edged sword. I do believe there's a lot of agency, organization responsibility in providing what is necessary for an advocate to do their job. But nobody's going to do it for you. Nobody's going to breathe for you. Nobody's going to learn how to manage their own physiology and psychological acute stress, right? So individual accountability comes into play. It's a dual role. Advocates have a professional responsibility to engage in the resiliency skills and coping skills and mechanisms necessary to be effective at their job. So there is that side of things. I just think there should be better support in whichever organization they're working for to lay a really healthy, solid foundation. Because admittedly, just like in any job that we could come up with, not everybody comes to the table with coping or resiliency skills. People only know what they know. And sometimes what they know isn't good enough for their worst day. So we have to bring the skills to the table that cover them on the worst day, not the best day. And second to that, which is going to impact any job, I don't think we have enough conversation about healthy sleep hygiene habits and healthy sleep protocols, because no matter what in the heck is going on, it's just going to be amplified so much worse if people aren't sleeping. And advocates work shift work too. They're not always in that conversation about the shift work. It's not a 9 to 5 job. They're called out, or if it's a 24-hour shelter, sanctuary type thing, they're working with people who are traumatized, sometimes at 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, trying to provide stability for that. So just shift work overall is going to impact people. And there's countless conversations on that and myriad job roles, but it's just something I just don't think it's talked enough about. What is good sleep hygiene and how do you make that? Because people have lives outside of their job, and sometimes their jobs impact that, their personal life impacts their sleep schedule. So what does that look like too?
That is such an important aspect of everything that we're talking about. And I know for a fact from my own personal life that I often had poor sleeping habits and didn't care, didn't worry about it. Looking back now, 20 years later, say, wow, I can see where that impacted not only my job, but my personal life, my kids, everything. I think it's a critical aspect of that. And I think there's not enough education out there about that.
No, there's not. And, again, it's that balance of organizational responsibility versus individual responsibility. And, where does that person, but, the law enforcement thing that always stuck with me, your agency doesn't die in the line of duty, you do. So where is the responsibility and obligation from a mental health aspect, psychological aspect, or as Dr. Robbie likes to talk about, psychological Kevlar? We have individual responsibility in that too. So a person does have to have the wherewithal to choose to engage in any of these resiliency skills, in any of these processes. They have to be dedicated to the program too, just like they would, whether it's exercise or eating healthy. I mean, there's so many tendrils of this about being a healthy, regulated person. It is about appropriate hydration. It is about eating clean. It's about brain flexibility. It's about good sleep hygiene. It's about having a connected network. Equally important to all that, it's about having purpose. And I talk to advocates about that quite a bit, because sometimes what survivors tend to lose on their journey is purpose. Life is very challenging when you have lost your purpose. And so we are open to that as well. What is the purpose for the advocates in their personal life? I'm not just talking their professional life. What is their guiding purpose and what they do? It's kind of why my favorite book is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I think everybody should read that book. How do you find purpose in suffering when life is not good? How do you handle that? And how can you still come to the table and look at yourself in the mirror and just be able to move forward through suffering? What is overlooked is advocates suffer a lot too. And they don't have to. I just battle with that. I'm so sick of everybody's going to end up with post-traumatic stress, man. Not everybody has to have PTS anything. We can mitigate a lot, but holy cow, if we had really great programs, we can do a heck of a lot more prevention. We're kind of stuck in mitigation, right? But what about the prevention aspect? What about somebody that maybe they actually lucked out and had a fantastic childhood and they come to the table as an advocate with zero skills on the table? And then it's their job that creates the potential for the trauma. But if you have a really great life, you don't really have to develop coping skills. Like, it's a double-edged sword. Again, I mean, there's so many paths to go down, but there's just so much where it is individual responsibility. But I just think organizations need to take a good look in the mirror. The leaders need to look at themselves. Nonprofits, their board members need to take a good look in the mirror and decide, how can I best support these organizations so the employees are healthy enough to support trauma survivors, whatever their journey is, whatever they bring to the table.
Yeah. What about that engagement part? Do you encourage then some of those frontline people and people who are not up that chain of command so much to actually speak out to their higher ups and their bosses and supervisors and say, hey, what can we do to change this culture? How can we help change what's going on inside so that I feel better and my colleagues feel better?
And that's honestly a tough spot for a lot of people to be in. There's job security issues, to be honest. Maybe they feel if they speak up about organizational well-being and health and their individual accountability to what that looks like, that actually may put a lot of people in a spot they don't want to be in. So if I had my way, would I of course encourage people to have organizational and agency wellness? Absolutely. But I've also seen, I'm just gonna be honest, Dave, the ramifications when people do that, it's not supported.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes the best thing to come to the table with is the conversations of individual peer to peer. How can we support each other if nobody else is going to support us? How can we talk about, like, maybe when we're just doing our shift pass along, stuff like that? How are we bringing these skills to the table? And we each talk about it to each other. So we can support each other on, honestly, the lowest level, but in some ways, maybe the most important level, because those are the people that are dealing with it. Those are the people who are the front face of those, the advocacy part of those organizations. I wish I could tell people to go out there and have those discussions with some of their leadership, and maybe, like I said, whether it hits the nonprofit boards and what that looks like. But I've also just seen that that can sometimes put people in what they feel is a very compromised position. Should they be able to? Absolutely. Should they absolutely be able to have those conversations? Sure. Is it a big challenge depending on the organization? Yes.
Absolutely.
And so that's where I would never want to put somebody in a position they felt uncomfortable about losing their job with that kind of encouragement, but it would be best if it was just, again, throughout the agency, throughout the organization, and becomes a cultural shift. And it doesn't even happen, even if you want it to happen quick. Even if everybody's on board, it's like turning the Titanic. Let's be honest. Culture doesn't change quickly, even with the best of intentions. So I would just kind of throw that out there, because I think it's a tough spot sometimes for line level employees to be in, to be able to affect those changes.
There's another benefit to what you're saying, that in that relationship of colleague on colleague support for each other. And research has shown about this, and I know you've brought it up before too, that helping someone when you recognize that they're hurting, reaching out and helping them is actually helping yourself. That aspect of being an advocate for your colleague is being an advocate for yourself. And I think there is a chain reaction that happens in that, and that can ultimately change culture, as you're saying, that's a great place to start. If you can't go leadership, go to your colleagues and say, hey, I notice you seem to be a little stressed out. Can we sit and talk for a few minutes? Can we have this discussion that you just mentioned?
Right. Or just even like that grounding skill I was talking about earlier, can, like a shift change, honestly, can seriously, in like a shift turnover, can everybody take 60 seconds and just like sit with that for a minute? They'll laugh and crack up in the beginning. I'm telling you, that's just what happens. Like it's kind of funny, right? What happens beyond funny is it works, and then it becomes normalized. If you don't do it at home, but you agree to do it at work, and you're working, because let's be honest, sometimes not, it's like 4-10, sometimes 12-hour shifts, then you're still doing some grounding 4 days a week, and you're doing it at work. And can we talk about that? We have emotions. I think that's the biggest thing. And this should have gone away a long time ago. We're still a little stuck in it. We're not robots. We can feel all sorts of things. We can feel whatever we want, but we know where we get in a pickle is what we do with that. And if it's not regulated, because we do feel angry, we do feel hurt, we feel sad, we feel sometimes just hopeless in the face of dealing with some of the things that we see. The other area that we don't really discuss from an advocacy perspective, because of course we should never feel like this, but we do. What happens when you're dealing with a client who disgusts you? What happens when you're dealing with somebody who scares you, who makes you fearful? Oh God, you're not supposed to feel like that about a survivor. Back up a minute. We can't account for how every individual human being is going to feel. What's the bigger conversation? What do I do with these feelings? I'm allowed to feel any way I want, but I have to be able to regulate it, and I have to be able to be a respectful, appropriate human being in my professional role. I mean, I think that's something we don't talk about enough too. Everybody gets sucked into, we're going to quote unquote feel sorry for everybody. That's not the only feeling we have for people when it comes from an advocacy perspective. Frustration, anger, hurt, pain, reliving, maybe if you have a similar experience. What about that? Maybe they're sharing something with you and it triggers your own unmanaged trauma, your own stuff from your childhood. Trust me, if y'all think that advocates aren't engaged in abusive domestic violence relationships that may have a coercive and predominant aggressor partner, or somebody who has a substance use problem and is acting outside the norm, That's not how it works. People coming to the table have all sorts of things going on. So there's that too. And I just think we need to have a larger discussion in that area too. I'm allowed to feel anything I want. Then what do I do with it? And that's all going to go back to kind of what we're talking about here, like coping, resiliency, being allowed to be okay, knowing it's okay to feel how you feel. I think people feel alone in their feelings. Nobody else feels like I do. Nobody else has been disgusted. Nobody else has been scared. Nobody else has felt as angry as I am hearing what a survivor told me. Nobody else has felt as hopeless, feeling I'm one advocate. I can't change the world. And people just tend to feel real isolated when they get those overwhelming negative feelings. For anybody listening, legitimately, whether you're a survivor, whether you're an advocate, whatever your role is, I'm telling you right now, you are absolutely not alone. You're not alone in anything you're feeling. And then we just have to move on to what is our role and responsibility and obligation to be supportive, and how do we best do that?
That is exactly what many of the victims and survivors who come on this show talk about. That feeling of isolation that they were feeling before they had the opportunity to tell their story, to have somebody listen. I think that's a critical aspect of what you're saying, is having a compassionate, empathic ear to be able to tell your story to, but to have that person so well grounded that they can hear it. I think we need more of that from both sides. Yeah.
Absolutely. One thing I tell police officers is the same thing I would tell advocates, to be honest. Sometimes that day you are it. The person that you're talking with is going to turn over something to you. It is going to be traumatic. It may be horrifying. It may create this visceral response in you that you may want to recoil. I want people to reframe their way of thinking. And instead of taking all the negativity, I want them to look at that. Somebody picked you and they handed you the biggest gift they ever could. They handed you a gift. They gave you everything that's been bottled up, everything that they've been feeling, all sorts of things that have been going on, and they picked you. It's you that day. And that is a gift. That is an absolute gift. And, we can really honor that person with just a moment of silence and just say, thank you for trusting me enough to share that. That's huge. You want to build relationships and help people feel supported. What's missing, especially in the world of sexual assault and domestic violence, is victims don't feel they are believed. They really don't. That's what the studies support. That's if they've been sexually assaulted and God forbid it happens again, they tend not to re-report to law enforcement because they don't feel believed. I mean, that's what the studies show. The number one reason people don't report, period, they feel they won't be believed, may report again, is that core of disbelief. So I tell people, it's not about you. I mean, this is huge to me. And I teach it in law enforcement too. Anybody that's in a role where it's service above self, if you think it's about you, wrong job, move on. It has to be about the service. It has to be about the support. And if you look at your role as supportive to someone, then when they have gifted you something, you may look in the lens of horrifying or awful or whatever that is, because it's creating something inside you. I tell you what, you do yourself a favor if you go through that compassionate lens and just be like, thank you for trusting me enough to share this. That builds and makes relationships. It's huge.
And that's what changes societies and cultures. It's what we've been talking about since we started talking 45 minutes ago. Totally agree with you. I think you're spot on. And it begs the question, when is Nicole Florisi going to write her book?
That's a darn good question. I'll make you this deal. I got to get my doctorate finished up, man, because there's no time to write a book when I'm trying to go to school. Yeah. Tell you that.
Well, I think it's awesome that you're doing that. And I also think it's awesome that you take the time, as you did today, to come on this show and share with victims and survivors and first responders and others who need to hear these things and need to learn about all this. You're there for that. You've done this 3 times now for me.
I just want you to know it's my pleasure to be on your show. You are doing good work, amazing work, to be honest. And most importantly, you are giving a voice to the voiceless. And I don't think anybody can really understand how foundational that is.
Thank you. It's the purpose. And I agree with you that it's needed. It's making an impact because my listening audience is growing. And that's a really good sign that it's having an impact for the good. And it's people like you that help bring my audience back. It keeps growing. Thank you again.
You are very welcome. Thanks, Dave.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I want to give a huge shout out to Nicole Florisi for the time she spent with me this week to help us all come to a better understanding of the impact of vicarious trauma on victim advocates and what we can all do to help alleviate symptoms and effects of vicarious trauma, as well as the trauma that comes from being a victim or survivor of sexual assault or rape. Nicole's insights and information are invaluable, and her passion is palpable and infectious. Thank you, Nicole. The value of your presence on this episode is immeasurable. I'd also like to renew my invitation to those of you who are listening who've been raped or sexually assaulted and feel you're ready to tell your story on this podcast in order to further your own healing process or help others with guideposts as they navigate their way on their healing journey. Just email me at davemarkel@gmail.com. That's DAVEMARKEL@gmail.com. And we'll talk about the possibility of you being on this show. Please subscribe and rate this podcast on your favorite podcast platform. And feel free to send me your comments of encouragement or how the show has impacted your life. I'd love to hear from you. Please do all you can to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. And as always, start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been affected by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.